I was 15 when I got involved with the most well known death row inmate in American history. It started when a friend told me about this man named Troy Davis. Davis was convicted in 1991 of murdering a police officer. There was no physical evidence at the scene, no gun, no DNA. So instead, the conviction was based on 9 eyewitness testimonies. But in the years since the trial, 7 of those 9 eyewitnesses said that they had lied at the trial because they had been either intimidated or coerced by police. I had this blind faith in the justice system, and this just seemed too evil to be true. I didn't want to believe it. But there was one small detail that I couldn't get out of my head, and it was the fact that the state of Georgia was due to execute Troy Davis 6 days before the U.S. Supreme Court was supposed to review the case. So why couldn't they just wait one more week for the highest court in the land to review the case? According to the Death Penalty Information Center, data published on February 22nd of 2022, since 1973, 186 people on death row have been exonerated. They go on to state that we will never truly know how many innocent people have been killed. In this piece, we examine how one person's story of their interactions with a death row inmate leads them to uncover the horrors of death row politics. Coming of Age on Death Row by Gotham Narala. Something was wrong. When the Supreme Court, 90 minutes before the execution, stepped in to say that they could review the case, for the first time, I wanted to write a letter, a physical letter. I didn't know how to write one. My dad had to help me put the stamp on the right place, and I accidentally switched the to and the from. But I wanted to write him a letter so that way he knew that there was someone out there who cared that there was something so obviously wrong with this case. And when I found out later that same week that Troy not only read my letter, but that he wanted me to visit him on death row, I was conflicted. I didn't want to go. I was scared. He was 39, I was 15. He grew up in a poor neighborhood full of drugs and gangs. I grew up in an affluent suburb full of manicured lawns and overpriced coffee shops. And he was a convicted cop killer. I was the president of a chess club. But Troy Davis could face another execution date in a matter of days. How could I say no to him? It reminds me of when my dad and I would walk through downtown Atlanta and people would ask us for money. Usually, my dad would just avoid eye contact and walk right through, or he'd lie and say that he didn't have any money to give. They'll probably just spend it on drugs, he said. But it felt wrong to not help someone when they were in need. And now, Troy Davis was less than 100 miles away from me, possibly about to be executed for a crime he did not commit. I couldn't just walk through this time. So I decided to visit him on death row. And I was too young to drive. My mom got behind the driver's seat, and we made the 2 hour drive down to Georgia's death row. And when we got into death row, we had to check in. And if Troy hadn't submitted our names ahead of time, we wouldn't have gotten in. Security took our wallets, IDs, keys, and we walked through this Orwellian hallway that had these motivational phrases of integrity, courage, and justice. And then you go up this flight of stairs to this lobby, and on the left side of this lobby, there is this row of vending machines, which will rapidly deplete the 80 quarters my mom and I bring. Because when an inmate has visitors, the prison refused to feed them. So we had to replace Troy's lunch. Death row inmates are kept 3 at a time in these special visitation cells. I told one of the guards that I was here to see Troy Davis, and he motioned me towards him, and he unlocks the door, ushers me in, and locks the cage from the outside. And so here I am, 15 years old, in a cage with 3 death row inmates. and the only guards on the other side of that locked door. The first thing I noticed about Troy was just how gentle he was. As soon as he saw me, his face split into a wide grin, and he thanked me for his letter, which he said was now hanging on the wall of his cell. He told me his side of the story about that night the police officer was killed, and how he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and how he didn't even have a gun that night. Once he was arrested, the media, before he was even found liable, had erased his identity as Troy Davis and given him a new one: cop killer. He was forced to deal with the realities of being a black man in Georgia in the 1980s, accused of killing a white cop. When our time was up, Troy hugged me and he said, "I'll see you again real soon." Fast forward 3 years, and Troy is now the face of a nationwide movement with millions of people signing petitions trying to get his execution halted. Talking heads on CNN discuss the case daily. There are rallies in most major American cities and many European ones. And I always try to remind Troy of this because that way he knew that there were people on the outside fighting for him. Troy started signing his letters as Uncle Troy, and he started calling me his adopted nephew. He'd ask me about my grades and remind me to study for tests. He was even more excited about my SAT score than my own parents were. And he taught me dance moves for my senior prom because I was a really bad dancer and he was good. And he'd make fun of me for how awkward I was around girls. And a lot of times we'd just talk about what he'd do when he'd get out. And he said on the first day he was going to do two things. First, he'd take a hot bath, which he hadn't done since 1989. And second, he would sleep at the foot of his mother's bed so that way she knew that when she woke up, it wasn't a dream, and that her son had come home for real. He says longer term, he wants to speak to school kids, especially troubled kids, and show them about how his fate had given him the strength to persevere for 2 decades on death row. So if he could do that, they could do anything. And he promised me that he'd take me fishing since I'd never been. And in exchange, I told him I'd teach him how to use a computer and how to use Facebook. Troy was always convinced that he was going to be set free. So that's why on all four of his execution dates, he refused his last meal. Because to him, it wasn't going to be his last. On his fourth execution date, September 21st, 2011, I just started my freshman year of college. It was a Wednesday, and I'd taken my first college exam. And I hopped in my little red Chevy and drove down to the prison grounds to join in on the protests. And at 7 o'clock, the moment of the execution, the crowd fell silent. And I just stared into the sunset, wondering if they were injecting Uncle Troy with poison right now. 2 minutes later, the crowd erupted into a roar. The Supreme Court had just issued a one-day stay of execution so they could review the case. And one last time, Troy had managed to pull off some miracle, because in all four of his execution dates, he had managed to pull something off. So I drove back down to my dorm, making mental promises to myself and Troy that I'd be back the next day. I was hanging out with some friends, trying to unwind that night, when I felt the phone buzz in my pocket. And I pulled it out. It was a text message from a friend. And that's when I learned that the one-day stay of execution was a lie. I don't know if it was an intentional lie or just misinformation. But the fact of the matter was, the Supreme Court had just delayed the execution for a couple of hours, and that Troy Davis was due to be executed today, right now. And instead of being out there on the prison grounds with him, I was hunched over in a couch in my dorm room lobby, watching Anderson Cooper count down the hours and finally announce that the state of Georgia had executed Troy Davis.